Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out to the Rubin Museum of Art here in Chelsea, New York. I'm Tim McHenry. I'm Director of Programs and Engagement. And this year, for those of you who are perhaps coming to the Rubin for the first time, we're taking the annual thematic of a very timely topic. We're exploring the nature of power. And to most people, quite frankly, power means the accretion of material, personal, objects by which to fortify and express your will over others. But our inspiration at the Rubin, due to the collection of Himalayan art that we have, comes from a different source, and it's largely from the Buddhist and Indic precepts and philosophies that look at the dangers of being wooed and misled by the material in our lives, and rather thinking more that true power is when you're not beholden to that material. So that true power comes perhaps when you let it all go and become totally vulnerable and are not, sort of basically living the unconditioned existence. And so we're exploring and navigating this sort of primal need to hold on to stuff that our society seems to be so keen on doing, and yet introducing a very counterintuitive philosophy that requires us to do absolutely the opposite, and which is more real. So that's what we're exploring this year, and I urge you to go to a number of floors upstairs, but in particular the 6th floor, which is pertinent today because we're looking at this extraordinary and weird interchange between some of the most powerful people in the world's history, i.e. the emperors of China, and their need to get validation from precepts who were of Tibetan, Buddhist, philosophic and religious standing. And that dichotomy is a really interesting one that we're exploring on the 6th floor. So you'll have time after this, our galleries close at 6 today, to explore those, and your ticket is also admission to everything on the floors. So today we've got a very pointed aspect of power that we want to address, and sex has a lot to do with it, so get ready. Hector Garcia, who is our scientist in our brainwave session this afternoon, comes from the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Texas, at the health center there at San Antonio. And in his research in looking at the environmental, evolutionary sources of how we behave and why we behave, the way we behave, he's really come out with an understanding and a premise that really puts sort of sexual competition at the center of our political behavior. And that's why he's entitled his latest book that just came out last month, Sex, Power, and Partisanship. And it's no more, its relevance today is just as potent as it ever could have been. And the subtitle is How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. So we're going to try and make sense of that for you today with his help. He is going to be sharing the stage with not only somebody whose work has been informed by Dr. Garcia's research, but also in this sort of male-dominated climate that we're going to be discussing a little bit, his occasional sparring partner. So whatever happens on stage will be real, people, okay? So get ready. But it's Sebastian Junger, who of course has become our preeminent conflict journalist of our time, and largely due to, of course, his first book, War, in 2010. He's written on many other topics besides, but that's what he's known for, doing this extraordinary thing, going to the front line and reporting what he sees with both passion and dispassion and objectivity and also real empathy to us who can never understand what happens there. And he's brought that home to us in a very, very potent and meaningful way in his writings. And his last book, called Tribe, which came out just before the election, May 2016, he really touches on something, and I think spurred by Hector Garcia's studies too, an issue that I would just like to read an extract about because I think it will register and might inform this afternoon a little bit. So he writes on page 125, I know what coming back to America from a war zone is like because I've done it so many times. First, there is a kind of a shock at the level of comfort and affluence that we enjoy, but that is followed by a dismal realization that we live in a society that is basically at war with itself. People speak with incredible contempt about, depending on their views, the rich, the poor, the educated, the foreign-born, the president, or the entire US government. It's a level of contempt that is usually reserved for enemies in wartime. Except now it's applied to our fellow citizens. Unlike criticism, contempt is particularly toxic because it assumes a moral superiority in the speaker. Contempt is often directed at people who have been excluded from a group or declared unworthy of its benefits. Contempt is often used by governments to provide rhetorical cover for torture or abuse. Contempt is one of the 4 behaviors that statistically can predict divorce in married couples. People who speak with contempt for one another will probably not remain united for long. Let's unite Dr. Hector Garcia, Mr. Sebastian Junger.
Thank you. So this topic of power, it has been of great interest to me, and I like to study abuses of power just because of the implications those abuses have for human suffering. And I really love the evolutionary sciences as a tool to understand power dynamics, especially as they occur in religion and politics, because they have such explanatory power. They can explain with great clarity things that can be confusing to us, utterly confusing to us, like politics. You know, so how many of us have, in observing the political spectacle, have just shaken our heads in disbelief, whatever side of the aisle politically you fall on, or felt a sense of anxiety, you know, but these sciences are able to do what the usual political discourse falls short of, and that's explaining the ultimate reasons for things, right? The why, the evolved purpose of our likes, our dislikes, even our policy preferences. Why half a nation can be repelled by the words of a president, and why the other half can be inspired by them. So I just think that, and this topic of power, I think, is especially apropos to consider through the evolutionary sciences, because, you know, the fact is we're primates. You know, we're social primates, and we live in dominance hierarchies. And in many ways, dominance and power are the same thing. So with my new book, Sex, Power, and Partisanship, I try to explain what partisanship really is, where does it come from, why does it have such a gendered feel about it. Chris Matthews once called Republicans the daddy party and Democrats the mommy party. This is something that the popular press has really noticed. Ann Coulter once boasted that she's more a man than any liberal.
It's possible.
It's possible. But the important point to understand is that when we're trying to figure out what power means in the political arena, we have to understand our reproductive psychology. You know, the ways that the strategies, the psychological strategies that we use to compete for reproduction and survival, and especially that of men, because, you know, power has far greater implications for the genetic fitness of men than it does women, but fitness being the extent to which you can reproduce your genes across time. So I'm glad to have you here, man, because we have so many niche interests in common.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really important today in our lives to understand that there are a lot of words like power that seem to have a negative moral connotation. You talk about power and you think, oh, well, power is a bad thing because people use power to oppress the powerless. And when you talk about humans as you know, but I think it's really important to establish this, when you talk about humans as a species, which we are, we're not divine beings. We are firmly in the animal world.
Yeah.
You have to be able to use words like power and dominance and things like that without moral content. Power can be misused, and then you have a moral conversation. But when you just talk about power, when you're talking about dominance, you're talking about it in a neutral way, as you might with chimpanzees. Or like, for example, I have a dog. She's an 11-year-old female. I have a property on Cape Cod that's next to a farm. And on that farm, there's 3 guys and 2 dogs. And when I'm there with my dog, even though she's an older female, she's dominant among those dogs. When I'm not there and she's there on her own, she is non-dominant. So you just have to, so that word is part of the animal kingdom, and we have to, I just want to remind people, we have to be able to talk about these things without immediately reverting to a sort of like, oh, that's bad. It's bad and good. It's both things, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, I think in the world of biology, power and dominance usually means preferential access to things that are important to our fitness.
Right.
Mating opportunities, food, territory, and for people, money. Right. So one of the things that I unpackage in the books is that in many ways, liberalism and conservatism reflect a psychology to help us navigate the primate hierarchy.
Right.
So in many ways, liberalism is a way to keep from falling down the hierarchy with all its emphasis on equal rights and affirmative action and things like that. Whereas conservatism is largely reflects a really old psychology to help us maintain dominance. But I think power can be dangerous, and it can cause a lot of problems depending on how it's acquired. And I think one of the main things that I like people to know, or I guess one of the main slices for examination that I look at with regarding power is how male dominance hierarchies seek power and what purpose it serves. And you've taken a slightly different slice of examination in your book Tribe, which I think is brilliant, by the way. It's more like the phenomenology of what it means to be in a male coalition, if that's fair. The sense of belonging, the sense of security, where that comes from evolutionarily, and what honor means in that culture. Right. Whereas I tend to focus on all the negative aspects of male coalitions, because look, if there's ever a war that's been fought, it's been male coalitions at the center of it. If there's ever been genocide, it's been male coalitions. Mass rape, male coalitions.
Well, I mean, it's like violence, right? Violence, is it good or is it bad? It's quite good if someone's attacking you. If you don't have a capacity for violence, you and your family are going to die, right? If there wasn't violence in the first place, you wouldn't need to be violent. But there is violence. Like we live in a natural world where there attacks happen. So again, I think we have to understand is that everything that humans are, we are for a reason, because that resulted in our evolution, in our being here today, and so you don't want to moralize human traits, because that's why we're here. The question for me is, what do we do with it now? And we didn't evolve to live in a world of 7 billion people, right? Now, what do we do with these traits that got us here? but now we have to make them work in a context which is in some ways deeply unnatural. And I'm going to ask you a question. So I'm left wing. I'm a Democrat. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I had an argument with the wife of a friend of mine who sort of said that the patriarchy had installed Donald Trump in power. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, more than half of the people who voted for him were women. So, I mean, if it's the patriarchy is also composed of a lot of women, if you want to call it that. But I think that's a simplistic analysis.
Yeah.
And so this is what I would ask you is for a man who I think pretty obviously, even among his supporters, is acknowledged to be a bit of a moral challenge, right? Yeah. Particularly if you're female. How can it be? Why would sane, presumably psychologically healthy women vote for him in such numbers? Like, what happened there? Let's explain it. I assume they were looking for good things for this country. Like, what do you think the explanation of that is?
That's a great question. So the fact is that most of our history was our early history was incredibly violent. And I think we have a hard time wrapping our minds around that living in peacetime civilian world. You maybe not because you've seen war all over the world, but what was very common was men within the tribe forming coalitions, war parties, forming war parties and raiding the rival tribe, killing all the men, taking the women as their spoils of war, taking all their goods. That was so prominent in our evolutionary past. Lawrence Keeley is an anthropologist who found that among contemporary hunter-gatherers and foragers, up to 30% of the men in these societies were killed by other men.
And there's an interesting statistic related to that among the Yanomamo. Men who had killed other men in combat were way more likely to have more wives and more children than non-combat men.
And it's
Think
all
about
tied
that.
into that reproduction,
Right.
the drive for reproduction, those imperatives. But so that was a game of living back in those days.
Yeah.
And in many ways, political conservatism reflects the scars of that kind of lifestyle. One example is this kind of foundational measure that looks at the underlying psychology of political conservatism called right-wing authoritarianism. Right. So the measure was developed in the aftermath of World War II when the world was trying to make sense of what the hell gave us Adolf Hitler. It has three factors in this scale. Submission to authorities, and the authorities in our past were often big, loud, strong males. Right. Adherence to rules and customs and conformity to rules, and aggressing against the outsider. So, the fascinating thing is when you look at those factors, they map onto the social organization of the military in like lockstep. Right. I mean, in the military, you have to obey the power structure. You have to right. defer to authority. If not, you're going to be slaughtered on the battlefield. You can't have decision making be democratic.
So the women who voted for Trump, just broadly speaking, do you think unconsciously they were looking for someone that they could trust to protect their community? I mean, like on some basic human level, like what was it they were voting for, do you think?
So, yes.
Yes.
That's precisely it. I mean, you have this. So let's take a step back and look at another underlying piece of psychology that's associated with being politically conservative. When you look at our tendency to fear things, our sensitivity to fear, it falls on a natural curve, right? There's a big lump in the middle and two wings. So, those on the more fearful end of the natural curve tend to be conservative. And I think it's important to explain it in that with that directionality because our tendency to fear far predated anything like political orientations right. or political parties. Included in that is fear of germs and right. fear of outsiders, xenophobia. So conservatives tend to be way more on the fearful end of that curve, right? And liberals tend to be on the more xenophilic end of that curve. So like more interested in people, more interested in other cultures. They travel more. They're more likely to speak a foreign language. Well, in our evolutionary past, those kinds of fears benefited us tremendously, right?
Right. Right.
Because who were the biggest vectors of disease? Other humans.
Right.
An outsider would bring in something as simple as a common cold that would wipe out your entire tribe. Right. So having a prejudicial psychology benefited us, right?
And could you say that aggression is a function of fear? I mean, is that why you see aggressive policies among conservatives?
Oh, I think they're tied in. I mean,
Yeah.
even tied into the same brain structure. In fact, when we compare the liberal brain or highly partisan brains, like people who are on the conservative end tend to have a bigger amygdala. That's the fear and aggression center of the brain.
Right.
You know, so the big question I often ask is, you know, does that still serve us today to the extent that we have that adaptation? We're moving towards a globally interconnected world, whether we like it or not. We're connecting culturally, we're connecting through economies, we're connecting, you know, just through people. But to answer your question, so you have a subset of our population that's naturally more fearful, and then you have somebody like Donald Trump, who's kind of loud,
Right.
promising he's going to protect us from the Mexican rapists, promising he's going to fortify our territory literally by building a border wall, who accentuates how big he is with everybody. I mean, you know, little George Stephanopoulos, little Rocket Man.
Right.
That's really primitive stuff.
Yeah.
So yes, the more fearful end of the population, that's going to resonate emotionally in this very intuitive way that probably they're mostly not conscious about.
Right, right. But that, in this sort of hashtag Me Too era, that feels horribly impolitic to say when you talk about female voters. It seems like there shouldn't be anyone voting, no woman should vote for Donald Trump. But actually, I think you could probably say biologically women are more vulnerable than men are, generally. And so they would be, I'm assuming, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I would assume they'd be looking for a figure that would seem dependable and able to protect them. I mean, it's interesting sometimes, just in casual conversations with women that I know, one of the things women really often say when they're looking for a partner, you know, they want a boyfriend, they want, what kind of guy are they looking for? And often, I mean, I feel like I even shouldn't even say this, but I feel often they will say, I want someone who makes me feel safe. Like on some level, I want to feel safe. And to me, there's nothing wrong-minded about that. I mean, there's that's an incredibly powerful imperative to feel safe. I have a 2-year-old. When I carry her on the street, you know, if you're carrying a 2-year-old, you cannot defend yourself from I mean, there's a lot of crazy men walking around New York City, right? And you cannot. I mean, on my own, I feel like okay, and I feel like I can outrun anyone who can beat me up. You know, so like I feel like I'm good. But with a 2-year-old, you are stuck, right? And so what I wind up being is very placating of traits that I think women often have developed out of a survival imperative. I can be quite placating with people that seem problematic. And I also, if someone on the subway car just seems like they're going to be a problem, I start looking around for someone where I can get someplace safe with my baby where we're going to be okay. I mean, so I feel like even as a man, I sort of understand that, like, oh, we need someone to take care of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that was at play in U.S. politics in the last couple of years?
No question. Oh my gosh. And you know, I probably should have said this earlier, but when we talk about evolutionary science, I always like to mention the caveat that we got to be careful not to commit the naturalistic fallacy. And that fallacy would state that just because something is arrived at biologically or genetically, it doesn't mean that that our adaptations are moral necessarily or just or that they're inevitable. Oftentimes it's not, you know.
Right.
And every single piece of technology that we have around us is an example of how we can transcend our genes. So that being said, there's a mountain of evidence suggesting that women tend to prefer taller men. Protection may have served a function in our evolutionary past that drives this trait. There's a study showing that women tend to prefer men with light facial scars. It kind of blows your mind. Why? Because that suggests a history fighting, as opposed to men without light facial scarring. So that was part of our history. Our history was very fraught for women, and it runs deep. And sometimes it makes sense for women to go with the tribe that's going to go with the male alliance that's going to protect you from the other male alliances amassed at our border, who are trying to come in and kill all our male relatives and kill all our children and take us for sexual slaves. It makes sense to ally with that. It's very old.
Right. There was one amazing study that I read that they showed photographs of young men to young women who I think were, they were in college, I think in Canada, so they showed these young women photographs of young men and had them rate them sexually. And what they found was that, so you can tell the level of testosterone in a man by his facial features. Like testosterone levels will change the shape of your face, and also are correlated with aggressiveness, obviously. And so what they found was that when the women who were ovulating consistently chose men with high testosterone more often as being attractive. So think about how that would play out in terms of mating. So when women are fertile, they're drawn to men with high testosterone levels, so those men are more likely to have more children, which continues this cycle of male aggression, male dominance, women choosing that as a protective mechanism. Like, where's that going to go? Of course, that's going to lead to conflict and aggression in our society, but these females are making they're making reasonable choices for their own interest and the interest of their own children.
Oh, and the research, it goes to a way darker place than that.
Oh, good. I thought, well, that was as dark as it got.
Oh, boy. Let me tell you. There's this phenomenon called the Bruce effect.
The Bruce effect?
So, the Bruce effect. So Hilda Bruce was a scientist who in the 1950s, I think, discovered that female mice who were pregnant, when exposed to a novel male, would spontaneously abort. And one of the reasons how we understand that is, when there are takeovers among primates, usually the dominant male will kill all the infants in the monkey troop or the group of rodents or whatever, which benefits his fitness. It's dark, it's the ugly math of evolution, but it benefits his fitness because that eliminates competitors for his genes. And that makes females go into estrus sooner.
Right.
So
lovely.
So from a female's perspective, it makes more sense to abort that fetus instead of spending all that time and energy, bringing it to term, just if it's going to get killed, right, by the dominant male. Something similar exists among women. One study found that after 9/11, there was a really prominent male fetuses were aborted across the U.S. after 9/11. Spontaneously aborted. And when you think about our evolutionary history, male offspring are the ones who were targeted by the outsider males as they conducted our raids. I mean, that's something that you see even in the Bible. Moses gives a command ostensibly by God. Go into the rival tribe, kill all the boys, kill all the men, and take the women for your sexual slaves. I mean,
no, I'm not a doctor or biologist, but I think the way that would work is that male and female fetuses must be differently affected by cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So after an attack like 9/11, people have higher stress hormones, higher cortisol levels that affect fetuses differently, and female fetuses, I think, are more resilient anyway than males. And so that I think that, I'm just trying to explain how that would happen. Obviously, women are thinking, oh God, I have to.
Yeah, that's the proximal reason, right? The ultimate reason is that it benefits women less to spend all that time and energy rearing a male offspring that's going to be killed by the rival tribe. It's dark. So the point of all this is that, to a certain extent, a pressure that women faced throughout our evolutionary history was to ally with the strongest male coalitions. And we see that today, and I think there are corollaries with how women could have voted for Trump, grab him by the pussy, give him all that kind of stuff that really would seem to repel a lot of women from him as a person.
Right. I watched two female friends of mine, again, most of the people that I know are left-wing, and these women were, and they were talking with real puzzlement about why, despite all of their, Vietnam era, et cetera, why they liked men in uniform. Like, what was it about a man in a uniform that triggered interest? And I think it's something like this. Like, if the guy's in a uniform, he's part of the ultimate male coalition, which is the U.S. military. And that signals a lot. Like, if I date that guy, I get the whole U.S. Army behind him, on some unconscious level. Like, and that there's something to that, which feels, again, incredibly impolitic. But we are what we are. We're animals. I mean, we're social primates, and we operate that way a lot of the time, at least unconsciously.
Yeah, and that's why I think evolutionary psychology in particular is kind of like good psychotherapy.
Right.
Because it'll tell you not what you want to hear, but what you kind of need to hear. And it can be hard to hear sometimes. But look, I think we're so much more vulnerable if we don't understand these impulses, because are we more or less likely to enact our worst impulses if we don't understand them?
Right.
And that's why I always argue for a protected place in the conversation about who we are for the evolutionary sciences, which we're fighting for in this country. Notably against the political right, who wants to squelch any teaching of Darwinism in schools. But
and the left is also increasingly anti-Darwin for, I think, different reasons.
For different reasons. That's a great point. So this naturalistic fallacy. So I think it can be committed in different ways by those on the left and those on the right. Those on the left tend to think more like, well, gender inequality is bad. Therefore, any science showing gender differences must be a priori false.
Right.
War is bad, so any science showing that we have an inclination for it must be false. It's too disturbing to even think about. On the right, it's more like, well, we have an impulse for war, so it must be moral.
Right.
Right. So either way, you have to be careful to not commit that fallacy, just because these sciences can tell us so much about who we are.
One of the interesting things for me is when we've talked about this, that roughly 50% of our political viewpoint, political feelings can be predicted by genetics. So it's roughly 50% on average is derived from our genetic history. So there are people who are genetically predisposed towards conservatism or liberalism. And then the other 50%, of course, because it's not genetics, it's experience, it's nurture. And so all of us are statistically roughly sort of 50-50 experience. You grow up in a liberal family, you're more likely to be liberal, et cetera, and 50% genetic programming. So the point about this for me is that if it's wired into our DNA, it had to have been adaptive in our evolutionary past, which means that the conservative cannot say to the liberal, you're completely wrong and you shouldn't exist. We can prove that both political parties, both ways of thinking, need to exist or have needed to exist because they're encoded in our genetics. And it's really interesting when I say this to people. Left-wing friends of mine get equally upset. They get as upset as right-wing friends that there's any genetic component at all to politics. They want it to be completely. Everyone wants to be completely self-determining in this regard, but in fact, we're not. So for me, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. For me, if that's the case, it means that for a society to function in a healthy way, we actually need the dynamic tension between liberal and conservative thought. You need the mom and the dad. You can't do it. It's hard to do it with just one way of seeing the world. To do it in a way that's both safe and fair. I feel like liberalism takes care of fairness, conservatism takes care of safety. Just broadly spoken.
Yeah. And in many ways, I think liberalism and conservatism are designed to tackle the same thing, and that's male despotism. Liberals occurring within the primate troop to make sure that those at the top aren't impinging on everybody else's genetic fitness, and conservatism, the despotism of the outside troop that's just waiting to put their boots on our necks and take over for us. But the other thing is that our political psychology is we're not political automatons just because we have a tendency for something.
Right.
It's flexible, and it's adaptive too. I mean, one example is that after the 9/11 attacks, liberals took a more conservative turn after that,
right.
which really speaks to conservatism really was driven by the threat of outside males.
Yeah. Right.
Commonly, overlooked subject is the fact that all of the hijackers were males. They're a
Right.
male coalition.
Right, yeah, I mean, males are way more violent than females, and they also are disproportionately the victims of violence.
Yeah.
If you look at statistics
yeah.
for young males, young men and women, 18 to 24, I think the age group is, men die at roughly 6 times the rate of young women from accidents and violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to get back to your point, the point you made earlier is my question is, to what extent do we put one versus the other leaning to the foreground of
Right.
human affairs? Because male psychology, so what I said in the beginning, males, power has far different implications for male fitness than for the fitness of women.
Right.
To put this into perspective, let's think of the person who has the Guinness Book of World Record for the most offspring. He was a Moroccan sultan that lived in the 1700s who had 500 concubines and 888 children, and his name was Ismail the Bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
How did he gain that windfall of inequality?
Right.
He gained it by living up to his reputation, slaughtering everybody around him, taking their resources, taking their women. So men have an incentive for inequality, and that is represented in this male-oriented political psychology that's more focused on inequality because it serves male reproductive interest. Fascinating study. Men who have higher upper body muscularity in the research lab,
Like me and you, guys.
like me and you, share less in laboratory games. They share less. They give less to hypothetical nonprofits. Men who are administered testosterone or have higher endogenous testosterone share less.
Right.
So there's a dark side to this protective function that male psychology serves, and that's reproductive greed, which I think translates downstream to billionaires controlling everything, not paying taxes, telling the populace that that's what they want, and pointing the more fearful end of the populace towards socialism or the Mexicans or whatever to distract them from that ruse.
Right. Right, and then there's a countervailing force, which is the other voice in society, which sort of argues for equality and fairness, unsuccessly. I mean, it doesn't quite get us all the way there, but it blunts some of the. I mean, basically, like if you're aggressive and sexual male, statistically, you will leave more offspring. You will pass your DNA on more successfully than men who are shy and retiring and not sexually aggressive. I mean, that's the sort of irony and tragedy of all this. It's like those traits that we feel are really toxic are the most rewarded in Darwinian terms, in terms of what DNA shows up in the next generation. So, for example, chimpanzees. My friend Richard Wrangham, who's a renowned primatologist at Harvard, he wrote a book called Demonic Males about a lot of this. And so what he found was that chimpanzee troops, the males, would conduct raids, moving very quietly and cautiously into sort of enemy territory, the territory of a rival troop. And one by one would kill off the males of the rival troop, and once all the males were dead, they would take the females. Well, of course, those guys were leaving more offspring. They just had more females to work with. They were leaving more offspring than groups of chimpanzees where the males didn't do that, or who were worse at fighting.
Yeah.
So think about how that is that incentive towards aggression is still rewarded sexually, and what are the implications for our society? I mean, of course, there's going to be aggression. I mean, you can see how it works.
Yeah. But again, the interesting thing about robust chimpanzees compared to bonobos is that was driven by competition. So,
right.
So the Zaire River separates bonobo territory from robust chimpanzee territory. And Wrangham writes about this, how one of the things that drove that competitiveness among robust chimpanzees was the fact that they live in gorilla territory. And there's more competition for those natural resources.
Right.
So they dealt with it by becoming warlike and competing for territory amongst each other.
Right.
And there are parallels to how human warfare was driven by periods of drought, periods of, we can see this in the archaeological record, periods of drought, periods of starvation. That drove warfare because we were competing for resources in zero-sum competitions, right? But at that time, we were living hand to mouth through most of our history as a species. We were at the mercy of nature. So my big question, I wonder what you think about this, is that today nature is at our mercy. And if this warlike, male-oriented coalitionary psychology was designed to help us acquire resources, and believe me, I get it. If me or my children risk starvation, I would want to ally myself with the most badass group of males there who are going to get my back and get me the goods from the rival tribe.
Yeah.
But now we can feed the world in excess. Now we could erase starvation from the human experience. So how much does that serve us? How much? I mean, that's an honest question. I admit I'm left of center, but that is an objective question we need to ask. How much does that serve us now that we don't need to compete for food in most, technically speaking, we could feed the world.
Well, here's an interest, just to add to that question. So I was, a year or so ago, I was asked by the New York Times to write an essay about manhood, like what it means to be a man in modern society. And so I sort of ranged far and wide in my research, and I had a lot of evolutionary psychology and a lot of biology, all this stuff. And, ultimately, the conclusions I came to were that the sex differences were rooted in some real evolutionary needs, and that that you can't just wish them away. And the Times decided that wasn't in keeping with what they wanted to say, and so they wouldn't run the piece. I finally found a home for it in the National Review, right? Who were not opposed to the biology of all this. But my point is that there is among the left, there is a new sort of idea that the ideal, that manhood should really be something actually quite close to a female ethos of gentleness and kindness and non-aggression and all these things, right? I mean, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? There's a new idea like toxic masculinity and men need to be more like women. But what's so interesting about this, I think that ideal would fall apart immediately in a situation where we all felt our lives were threatened by an outside force. I don't think anyone would be arguing for that. But right now, that ideal is mainly centered in affluent urban centers, right, which are very much like the bonobos, right? There are not physical threats. There's plenty of resources. It's essentially what Hector was saying about the bonobos, which is that if you don't have competitors for resources and if you don't have an outside threat, what happens is a more collaborative, fair female ethos takes over. And that, I would argue, ends immediately when there's a physical threat to survival, and then this other thing kicks in. And I even found that among coal miners who were trapped in a coal mine disaster in Nova Scotia. And for the first few days, the spontaneous leaders that arose were very aggressive men that literally grabbed pickaxes and tried to hack their way out of the mountainside. And when that failed and the lanterns ran out of electricity and they were trapped in darkness with no water, no nothing, what happened as they sat there starving and dying of thirst before they were finally rescued was that different kinds of men took over as leaders, and there were men who were empathic and who were shared water attended to people's feelings, because the struggle at that point, sitting in the darkness, was not a physical struggle, it was a psychological struggle against losing their minds. So what you really needed was two different kinds of leadership to attend to two different kinds of threats.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree. I mean, you don't want to go out on patrol with a bunch of hippies. Right?
No.
That seems kind of dangerous. Right. But I do think there's some value to holstering that male ethos, bringing it out in times of war. I mean, right. When women have more of a say in how we govern, life gets better for everybody. Look at Scandinavia. Yeah. I mean, there's all these kinds of measures of societal health. Teenage pregnancy, crime, GDP, access to healthcare, education, that are associated with less religiosity and more power for women. A very poignant case study in this is after the Rwandan genocide, when roughly 70% of all the men in that country were killed. What happened? Women had to take positions in government. Healthcare, education for everybody increased. Mandatory sentencing and harsh penalty for rape.
Right.
So I guess the question is, to what extent we can't dispense with it altogether. We can't dispense with the protectors of our race altogether. But to what extent do we put them in the foreground and let them run things?
Right. I mean, well, I would say human society has probably always done this, that when things were safe and affluent, a more caretaking ethos took over within the community, and when there was a threat, the reverse was true, and there wasn't sort of room. I mean, the interesting thing about these leaders in this coal mine, the first set of leaders, was that they didn't care at all about how anyone was feeling. Like if you were scared or hungry or whatever, they just told you to shut up and dig, right? I mean, they just had zero empathy because the situation was too urgent. That zero empathy became actually destructive and dangerous later on when the waiting game began. So what I'm guessing is that Scandinavia is a very, very safe, peaceful place. And so I think it is, has this sort of some room to breathe, to live in what we would consider a more humane, compassionate way. I think that would shut down. I'm guessing that system would shut down pretty quickly if it was attacked.
Yeah, probably would. Probably would. The exception may be the United States, where we spend so much on the military. The military-industrial complex is just obscene. Yet we're the most overfed nation in the world. Yeah, right. That may be an exception. Something interesting about Scandinavia that I think may call into question, like, which came first, the genes or the culture.
Right.
There's research looking at our distance away from the equator is associated with greater political liberalism. And part of the idea is that if conservatism was essential to, at least the psychology underlying it was essential to helping us avoid pathogens, the further away you move from the equator, the less pathogens there are. Right. And the more women are sexually open. And that speaks to a lower genetic, a lower germ load. Right. So it's just fascinating. We're not what we seem. There are things controlling or influencing, I should say, our political preferences that we don't have much awareness of.
Right. Right.
But we need to have greater awareness of them. And it's still a fight. I mean, I live in Texas, where the Texas State Board of Education is striving to inject false uncertainty into evolution by natural selection. There's a fight.
Wait, say that. Say that again and make me understand. Like they're trying to. They're questioning evolution.
Questioning evolution, and Texas makes more textbooks, and the Texas State Board of Education controls. To some degree, what gets put into the textbooks that a lot of the U.S. shares, and they're controlled, but they're populated by a lot of right-wing, very conservative Christians who really don't want evolution to be in our textbooks.
Right. Well, I mean, I got to say, when I wrote this piece about manhood, it ended up being called the Anthropology of Manhood, If you're interested, you can find it on the internet. But one of the, I showed it to a lot of friends of mine. I was trying to get feedback. And like I said, a lot of my friends are left-wing, and some of probably the most common critique that I got was that evolution and Darwinism seemed too deterministic, and that when you use that as an explanation for human behavior, it's as if you were sentencing humans to the sort of dark ages of existence where might makes right and all that. Of course, science isn't trying to achieve an outcome. It's trying to explain a state of affairs, right? And so I'm just trying to explain things. But I found on the left as well, like this sort of weird resistance to Darwinism and to the ideas of evolution. Like, no, that's too deterministic. We all can be whatever we want. It's not really true.
Yeah. Well, we're smart. We can outsmart our genes. Homo sapiens means the wise man, the wise human. And that is our most fundamental adaptation, I think, to transcend our genes. Everything you see around you, the automobile, eyeglasses, sunblock, they're all examples of how we can transcend the cards that Mother Nature dealt us. But we have to talk about it. We have to swallow sometimes bitter medicine, and look into the mirror unflinchingly.
Right. Right.
I'm just noticing the time.
Are we taking questions today, or are we going to
We're
talk?
taking questions.
All right, great.
And I think now is the time for questions, unless you had anything else you want to add, Sebastian.
Well, Sebastian and Hector, you'll have time during the course of the questions to feed in other thoughts that may occur to you. But if we can have the house lights up, that'd be great, because we've got microphones on either side of the house. And as we've been talking about power a lot this afternoon, now comes the big transfer of power to you.
Yes, to the people, yes.
But here also comes the call for you to exercise the power of and discipline of delivering a question, number one, that is also fair to everybody else who wants to ask a question, so you ask it in probably the fewest number of words possible to get over the sense. Can we make a deal at least as far as that's concerned? That'd be wonderful. So we have an urgent question in the first row, so let's get the microphone here. And then we've got another question in the second row, Maggie. Thank you so much. Yes?
Yes, well, I'm going to rebel immediately because I don't have a question. I want
Then
to
I'll
postulate
take
a
the
couple.
microphone from you because
I
you made an
want to
agreement.
postulate a couple of things. That women are aggressive, but they're socialized differently than boys to control their impulses. Women who voted for Trump did not vote for Trump as much as they voted against Hillary. Men can't have babies. What is their purpose? If women were taller and stronger than men, what would our society be?
You did ask a question, what is their purpose? Okay, let's go.
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think that's something that scholars have attempted to answer. And like you were saying, I mean, the purpose is the purpose has been securing resources, protection, things like that. But my big question is how much do we want to put male imperatives at the forefront of human affairs? We need a proper balance.
A gentleman is going to now ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Your thoughts on a couple of personalities, a couple of people in your field or in this who've talked about this. Thomas Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. I can never pronounce his name right. He's
Jonathan?
Jonathan
Haidt.
Jonathan, right,
Yeah.
Jonathan, yeah. So I never get his name right, though I've met him. And Jordan Peterson.
Yep. So you want our thoughts on that?
Just your thoughts on what they've written about, talked about, and
Well, I think,
and your opinion.
yeah, I mean, I think Peterson got into some trouble. I quite liked the things he said. I mean, I thought he had a really interesting, sharp mind, and I think in some ways, I think he got into trouble by being almost autistically devoid of sort of like human inputs. Like, I mean, he reminded me of my father. My father was a physicist and capable of getting my younger sister extremely mad at him. But he wouldn't know. I mean, he would say to my mother, like, "Is Kalana upset with me?" Meanwhile, like, you can hear the china breaking in the back of the house, right? So I felt Peterson, in his like beautifully rational mind, got into trouble, not necessarily for what he was saying. I mean, all of it was extremely reasonable and backed by data, as far as I could tell. It was the way he was saying it just seemed, I think it was just sort of too much for people to have that kind of brain crunching the numbers without any sensitivity to how that might feel for people to hear that. I don't know if you want to add.
I have difficulty understanding what he's saying. A lot of times I kind of rewind what he says, like, what did he say? A lot of equivocation going on. I think it's both. I think some of the things he said got just run with, and I do think other things.
Sorry, Hector, for the benefit of those who don't know the whole situation, do you mind recapping in terms of the issue at stake? I mean, if it's germane to the conversation.
I'm not a big expert on Jordan Peterson necessarily, so I don't know if I'm an authority.
He was asked about the wage difference between men and women, and he, it's very easy to say, well, there's an 11, whatever it is, percent difference. It's outrageous. It needs to stop. It's very easy to say that, right? And he didn't. He said, well, let's try to understand where that 11% comes from. One of the things he said is that aggressiveness leads to raises. I'm not a very aggressive person. Like if I were working in a corporation, I'm sure would not have the salary that I could. Because I just, going into a boss's office and saying I want more money is like, I'm just like genetically incapable of it. So if you have a bell curve distribution of aggression that's different from men and women are going to be disadvantaged at that. So he was sort of going through, that's 1.3% of the difference, or what, he was sort of going through percent by percent what explained that difference. So when you do that, you might be completely right about all of it, but you sound unsympathetic, right?
Yeah.
You sound like it sounds clinical and like you don't care if it's that way or not. Like that's what he sounded. I don't think he meant that, but I think that's what he sounds like.
And it can be a little oversimplistic because, still women have to join the male dominance hierarchy in business. And there's really fascinating research showing that if women leaders are kind of by themselves and they're not surrounded by peers in Congress, in Parliament, or whatever, they tend to act more hawkish because they're joining a group of male, they're joining a male coalition. It's almost like that trope of if you ever go to prison, you have to go up to the biggest, meanest inmate and punch him in the face to establish yourself.
Right.
But the research finds that when there are more women peers, that goes way down.
Right.
So women leaders can scale back and perhaps maybe govern more in more a way that aligns with their evolved psychology. There's more compassion, less.
Well,
less Margaret Thatcher.
We're about to find out with the new Congress. It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And what's happening. Yeah, I know. Seriously, like I mean, I love that all those women came in. It's incredible. And I got to say, it wouldn't have happened without Donald Trump. I do not think that would have happened. And it's such a gift to the country that we've had that reaction, that our sort of antibodies have reacted in that way. No, but seriously, I mean, that's what an inoculation is. It gives you a little bit of the disease. And I mean, I'm speaking in a totally partisan way now. And I, as a journalist, I shouldn't.
He wasn't a biologist. So.
But I mean, then your body reacts, your immune system kicks in. And I feel like our democracy has done that a little bit with the travails of the last few years.
Yeah. And interestingly, just look at the makeup of those 110 women who are in the new Congress. I think 82 or 83 are Democrat.
Yeah,
That speaks to what we're
amazing.
talking about.
So let's distribute the questions. Let's take a question right in the back, Alison. Chap with the hat on, the blue hat. And then also another one right in the back row, Maggie. And then we'll come forward again. Yeah.
Hey, thank you guys so much. I wanted to revisit the inequality issue, what you were talking about. So at a societal or evolutionary level, feel free, but is there an argument that you guys have heard or getting feedback for a certain amount of inequality being good?
Do you mean income inequality?
It could be income, wealth, or food, at the evolutionary level. Yeah, like that the distribution of that being leading to better outcomes through, I don't know, hoarding or something else, and then redistribution?
Well, communism in the Soviet Union failed drastically. If that speaks to anything, I think there has to be room made for ambitions because creativity comes from that, with limits, and that's something that I personally, as a voter, as a citizen, wish there were more of in our government.
Yeah, but I think when you institutionalize advantages to an elite class that lead to just a reproduction of that income inequality, you've rigged the game.
Yeah.
And it's no longer a meritocracy.
No.
Understand that most of our evolution as humans have happened where we lived in groups of not even the number of people in this room, right? And so inequality in that context, where you were related to a lot of the people in your community, and you know everyone very well, and everyone's necessary for survival. When you have inequality in that context, it's extremely destabilizing. And with agriculture came the chance to accumulate food, accumulate wealth. With that came the opportunity to pay people to defend you, to carry out your wishes. All of a sudden, you get the modern state and capitalism. And capitalism has brought a huge amount of good to the world, but it does institutionalize this, what feels like a lot of unfairness. And I think the struggle for modern society is that the powerful, who have it within their means to rig the game so that they remain powerful, the powerful have to actually work to make sure that they are not unduly advantaged in the system. And that's asking for an awful lot of ethical behavior from people. But I think it's possible.
Yeah. And the thing, one of the things that I want people most to know, that if you don't understand your evolved psychology, others will use it to manipulate you, to gain more power. I mean, this is in writing. We know that global warming was intentionally made to become a tribalistic badge, Meanwhile, billionaires are already drenched in oil money, continue to amass these profane fortunes because of things like that. Not only about income inequality, but other things as well, like poisoning us against outsiders. We get manipulated by these impulses if we don't know them. So.
And what do you think the chances are that we're going to be further manipulated and cornered by the increase in global temperatures, which may then further the extent of the pathogenic extension further into what used to be cooler climates, and therefore causing a ripple effect further into societies?
That's interesting. We shall see. That's a fascinating question. It's an open question. Yeah.
We have a fascinating question in the back.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about the type of data that you're using to frame your arguments that both of you made in this discussion. You cited a lot of studies on animals, a lot of evolutionary data, and in addition to that, over the last 100 years at least, we have a lot of really great quantitative and qualitative data from women specifically who have lived through times of great upheaval, times of affluence, times of safety, times of insecurity. You haven't cited any of those really very, very much about what women have actually experienced and how they have decided to either create safety and power for themselves, redistribute safety and power among their communities. So my question is, what place do you think that type of data has or should have in the types of discussions we're having?
Not sure. Well, it's hard to cite a reference list, in a talk like this, but I think what comes to mind is I talked about earlier with Rwanda. I mean, women securing safety for themselves as they're governing, enforcing strict penalties against rape, for example, ensuring the security of their children by compulsory education, like education for everybody, not just a privileged class. So there are data on that. Yeah.
There's definitely data like that.
Yeah.
But what place should it have in framing discussions such as the one you've just had, compared to how much biology you cited, how much modern history have you cited?
Compared to biology and modern history, well, I think we have to avoid thinking in terms of nature versus nurture, because you can't, they operate in tandem with one another. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I would just say, if we're talking about humans, we are talking about a biological phenomenon. We are social primates, and our biology and our consciousness, our prefrontal cortex, allows us to make the decisions that run counter to genetic predispositions, right? So one of the products of our evolution is that we have, like, we're in the driver's seat to some degree and can decide what we want to do, how we want to behave. But the forces that we have to the genetic forces that we have to overcome, that we can choose to overcome, those genetic forces are still there. And so if you don't have a biological discussion about those genetic forces, the person in the driver's seat doesn't know what they have to overcome. I mean, you can't. Biology is an enormous part of this conversation about what we are and what we do.
Yeah. And I just want to say that this is one of 26 conversations about power and relationships between sexes, hierarchies, you name it. And so therefore we invite this diversity of opinion over a long range of time in order to better unpack the nuances that this really rich topic affords us. So I will just give you some recommendations. On March the 27th, Anuradha Bhagwati is going to be on stage with Dr. Jennifer Chan to talk about Bhagwati's experience in the Marine Corps as a woman and experiencing disrespect, witnessing rape, all sorts of horror stories which he's written about. And she ended up leaving the military and then suing the military for the right of women to take part in combat. So she's going to be on stage with a neuroscientist talking about that sort of resilience. And then another program that you might be interested in called The Masculinity Paradox is with the sex therapist Esther Perel and the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Ayad Akhtar, talking about some of these issues, but from a substantially different perspective. That program is sold out, but we'll be live streaming it, so you can always log on to our Facebook page and witness it in real time, but elsewhere. So that's just a few choices. So you had your hand up, didn't you? So let's get a microphone to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
In the book, Team of Vipers, Kellyanne Conway was quoted as saying that there's a huge difference between what turns you off versus what affects you. And so my question is a political one. How can the left do an effective job of battling the right in 2020? Any thoughts?
Is anybody running for office who is looking for tips here?
I mean, I think they are. I think they have been. I mean the midterms were, pretty impressive. I mean, I think they're doing an extremely good job. And I shouldn't say, I mean, again, I'm a Democrat, but I'm also a journalist, and I really try to speak in neutral ways. My problem with this situation, isn't that the Republicans won the White House. It's that Donald Trump won the Republicans, right? I mean, it's like that form, the way he thinks about our democracy, which is basically to not consider it one. That to me is the problem, and I would love to have a Republican administration back that's decent and forthright and honest. I mean, I would much rather that than a corrupt Democratic administration. That to me is really the important point. But I think, I think it's turning. I think it has turned around. I think they're doing an extremely good job at fighting this. The Democrats, yeah.
So we have time for 3 more questions. 2 hands have already gone back up at the back, and then a third one. All right, yes, let's take you in order. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating discussion. Throughout this whole conversation, there's been kind of half the population that I have wondered what the explanation is for their voting, which is men who voted for Trump. As fascinating and fiery as it is to talk about women who voted for Trump, what about the men? Are they just like bowing down? Is it like a recognition that they're weak? I mean, I don't, like, honestly, like, what? I don't get it.
Well, I think in many cases, men tend to vote in ways that serve their reproductive interests. So some men choose the path of going with the male alliance and the advantages that confers them. And that's based on their evolutionary psychology to a great extent, and where they fall in that natural curve. There's an impulse to go towards the male coalition. So it's old.
And men need a sense of safety too, right? I mean, we can be killed just like women. And so I think if you feel that the country's under threat, now people in this room may not feel that way, but some people do feel that way. If you feel the country's under threat, culturally, economically, militarily, you're going to vote for the person that you think will protect this country, whether you're male or female. I mean, that's not, you know what I mean? Like, that's threat. I mean, if there's a threat, that overrides almost every other human concern, right? And so for the people that feel threatened, I think they will vote for the person that takes that threat away.
Yeah, and the scary part is when the threat is manufactured.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
listen, there are certain political operatives that know this research. What happened during the midterms? There was this caravan of migrants coming up, marching all the way up to the border. What happened to them? Fox News aired a piece stating that they're going to be bringing disease. You think that was an accident? No, they know their base.
They read your
They're
book.
bringing smallpox. They're bringing smallpox. Forget about the fact that smallpox has been eradicated. I mean, the more fearful end of the natural curve, they're going to respond to that. And look, Trump's handlers know this. We have to know it too.
So just before we take our next question, if you don't mind, I just want to take that a little further and say, and ask a question about the manufactured fear, and also the retention of what actually bonds male groups. And Sebastian, this is probably a question for you. In your film, The Last Patrol, you spent time with buddies who had sort of coalesced on the front lines, and they came back to this United States and found that there wasn't really a place for them. And could you talk a little bit about what was recreated in order to make them feel safe amongst themselves when everybody else seemed alien to their understanding?
Well, one thing that promotes cohesion is a sense of surrounding threat. So I took two guys that I was out in Afghanistan, two American soldiers, veterans, that I'd known in Afghanistan in a very kinetic place, a place with a lot of combat that I was at called Restrepo, as well as a photojournalist, a Spanish guy named Guillermo, who was with my best friend Tim when he died, when he was killed in Libya. He was holding his hand. And I got to know Guillermo because that was my connection to my lost friend Tim. I wanted to know what happened. And we became very good friends. We walked from Washington, D.C. along the railroad lines, from Washington, D.C. to Philly to Pittsburgh, basically, sleeping under bridges and abandoned buildings and camping out in the woods. And we cooked, whatever. We got our water out of creeks, and we went through ghettos and walked through farms and ghettos and everything. And railroad line goes right through the middle of everything. So that was that was called the Last Patrol. And so what happened was, what we were doing was illegal. It was hard. It was miserable. It was great. Like, half of us were in the middle of getting divorced, and it never came up once in 350 miles. Like, what we did was a refuge, psychological refuge from the things that were affecting us. And so what happened, at one point someone shot at us in Pennsylvania. Someone shot at us. And, we had the most incredible, I grabbed the machete and tried to sort of run around and come up behind the guy. Someone else ran this way to distract him. Like, this thing kicked into gear where we're not even thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about the group we're with. It's a very, very instinctive thing. That feels so good to be with a group of people, in this case it was a group of men, that felt that way, and that I felt that way about. That to me, it was like a depressive being on Prozac, right? I was like, oh, this is it. This is what it's about. But I could see those guys and get a pizza with them. It wouldn't feel that way, right? I mean, it's a product of the situation we were in. And I think as the danger goes up, your individuality goes down because your survival becomes a function of how tight the group is. And as danger goes down, your individuality rises up because you don't need the group for survival anymore. And I think human society is constantly sort of toggling back and forth between those two poles and between liberalism and conservatism. I think it's doing a kind of four-way toggle between those four basic human poles.
A big question I have is, can we coalesce in the absence of an outside threat?
Right.
Do we need it? Do we have to create it to feel that?
Right.
But, yeah.
So before we take our last two questions, the authors will be upstairs at the book signing table to sign copies of Tribe and Sex, Power, and Partisanship right after this talk. Yes, I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Okay, so I love the discussion, especially like the biological explanation for our behaviors. I'm an evolutionary biologist myself, but I also know that our behaviors are not totally explained just by our evolution. We are rational animals. We can understand our unconscious bias and try to make better as a society. So we have, I love the explanations of the bonobos and the chimpanzees, our closest relatives, and they have totally different societies. So bonobos are much more peaceful, and they have a huge, females have a more, it's more like in the social hierarchy of the group, they have a more importance role than chimpanzees. They're very violent, and it's more male-dominated. Society. So we have two very close examples to our own species of totally different societies. So based on that, I think we can do better as a society and understand our conscious bias as a violent species. I would say like more in the middle between chimpanzees and bonobos. But understanding that unconscious bias, we can do better putting like more women in power positions and decision-making positions, because truth is, we see that from the bonobo perspective, a peaceful species that has a lot of like females in hierarchical roles of power, and that like work really well. So we can think about overcoming this unconscious bias and try to make better a society. And as you guys put it, like there's a very strong social conflict, like sexual conflict between men and women.
Yeah.
So the reproductive output between like difference among men is very different. Like few males in social societies have a lot of offspring, and a lot of them have very little.
Okay.
And the reproductive output of females are more balanced.
Can I just tell you?
Yeah.
Can I just tell you, I've had a lot of coffee.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you have a question, like.
Okay, so my question is, so how can we overcome this unconscious bias that,
By
like,
knowing
by
it,
evolution?
by understanding it, by reading about it, by accepting it, by studying it. I agree with what you said. You're right on. We have to study it. Yeah.
And let me just one point, just a sort of linguistic point. We can't put women in power. We have to vote them in. It's not a decision. It's a collective action, and for that to happen, women have to vote for women. You know, this is not a gender problem, right? This is a societal problem.
And I'll just add that, just bring this theme back to the Himalayan culture that we embrace here at the Rubin, there was a society in Central Asia that was called Tibet, and in that society, which was informed by a sort of Buddhist philosophic underpinning, there were training grounds for people to actually let go of that material possessioning that the rest of society and the world seemed to be embracing. But the irony is, of course, that a sizable part of that population, in other words, Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns, did not reproduce and carry their genes further to other generations. They taught. They did it by teaching. That transmission of wisdom is something that runs right through the art in these galleries. But that was a very structured way of being. And let's also remember that their very alliance with the political and military might of the Mongol emperors and the emperors of China that succeeded them allowed them to have this relatively peaceful environment in which to carry on that practice. Now that's gross oversimplification of that socio-political history, more of which can be seen on the 6th floor, and we're also doing a talk series about it. But it's the irony of not being able to change society genetically, but by a transmission of teaching and understanding. Tibet's one example of where that was perpetuated over centuries and centuries. So it's possible, but we have to work really hard at it.
Let me just say, just even in our society, the reason we don't need male coalitions as much is because we have a police force. I mean, if there was no police force, if it was just anarchy, I'd be looking for a bunch of other guys to take with our partners and make sure we were okay. Yeah. But we don't need to do that, right? There's a police force. We can call 911. And that, so even in America, the fact that we've institutionalized the use of power frees us up from the need, unlike in prison or something, frees us up for the need to seek out these male coalitions and then give them all the power.
So we've time for one last question that was in the, yes, okay, yes, sure. Let's Alison, if you don't mind, the microphone's coming to you right over there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Pressure for being the last question. But so the women that were happy to vote for a guy that runs around grabbing hoo-has, I was impressed that you are, or shocked that you were able to say that word yourself. But so not only, I lost my train of thought there when I was like, am I going to say the word? Not going to say the word. I think there are plenty of women that feel that women as a whole deserve to be relegated to second-class citizens. Not only do they feel like they need safety themselves, but a practical application of that, I have to go back in history kind of far, but I think of women's suffragettes, that there were plenty of women then who were opposing the right for women to get the right to vote. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, sometimes it makes sense to ally yourself with the male alliance. So there's research showing that when women get married, their views become more conservative, and they see their fates linked to other women. They're less linked to other women, and that to me is very striking. You know, the alliance is with the men, and you, if that's your alliance, you want to favor policy that benefits them. You want to favor the tribe that goes into the other tribe's territory and gets you goods.
Also, just so that it doesn't sound too grim, half of Trump voters were women, half of Hillary voters were men. Yeah. It's the other half of the coin, other side of the coin. Yeah.
Well, we've explored many sides of many coins this afternoon, and we've got many other coins to overturn over the next few weeks, so I hope you'll come back to the Rubin and join us. But, you know, you're not the last question, so the pressure's off, because right outside these doors, you'll see a long table. And the long table is an artistic, conversational piece, which you are the actors therein. So you can take a seat at the table and converse with each other and maybe form another sort of tribe. Who knows? But there are some guidelines about how to perform and behave at the table, so everybody has a voice. But you're invited, of course, armed with material, perhaps from upstairs, but you're invited to take part in that experiment in conversation, in dialogue, exchange, without prejudice, without necessarily having a conclusion. But that's a way of sharing power amongst yourselves that we can for you, that I hope you will take advantage of while you're here at the Rubin. We're open till 6. Explore the galleries. Again, the authors will be upstairs by the book signing table at the shop to sign copies of Sex, Power, and Partisanship by Hector Garcia, and of course, Tribe by Sebastian Junger. But the way we want to thank them this afternoon is Rubin style, of course. You know, we're a museum of art, by the way. I hope you realize that. But go upstairs and find out for yourselves. But what these two teachers have done is something very important, and which we need to perpetuate in our society. They have shed light on something that was not necessarily known and needs to be known through their various investigations and studies. And there's a deity in the Indic pantheon who does that on a regular basis. And he's pictured riding, massive chappie, riding on the back of a small little rodent, riding out of the dark, where rodents tend to congregate, into the light. He's called Ganesh. He's the elephant-headed god, and he's known as the remover of obstacles. Now, word of warning, he doesn't remove the obstacles for you. He enables you to see reality in a way that allows you to put what seemed to be the obstacle in perspective. And I think that's all what we need to do and work harder at as a society so that we aren't at each other's throats. We are not the obstacle. We could actually be a tribe. So, as a thanks for your instructions to us all, Hector Garcia, here is a little Ganesh for you to take with you back to Texas, where it could do a lot of good.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sebastian Junger. Don't put this anywhere near your 2-year-old. She's a little too young. She might swallow it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I hope you'll meet us upstairs if you've got further questions for the authors. In other words, go out and change the world with good intention. That's all we can do, right?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.